Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Chapter 6, Part 2.
Section 4.
An hour later, Neville was ringing the presbytery bell. He had had a good hour with Enid, till Mrs. Bessington had routed them out. Poor Anna had done her best. She had received a completely exhaustive account of Corfu. She had played her archdeacon, views unknown, and had been answered by a number of little biographies of other clergymen. She had listened, when more personal matters had been approached, to long descriptions of Rome and the character of the food to be obtained there, with parentheses on Neville and Enid that had made her wince more than once. And then, with a suddenness to which she had no parry, Mrs. Bessington had informed her that it was time to see what the others were doing, and that Enid must come indoors, and which was the way to the famous pavilion, because she was convinced that they were there. So, like a native guide attached to the attacking general's stirrup, Anna had led her all round by the paths, because the lawn was still wet, and up the steps. It was then that Enid had nodded to Neville to go, and he had left, hearing as he went the exordium of a discourse upon the porous character of red tiles and the harbourage they offered to damp. Mrs. Bessington's capacity for not seeing the wood for the trees, for missing the beauty or the interest of a place and fastening instead upon its least important detail, was abnormal. One of the very few advantages of the presbytery to Father Richardson's mind lay in the fact that when the bell was rung, the inhabitant could peep swiftly through the sitting-room window and see who was there. Neville then, after seeing the priest's head dart like a bird's between the lace curtains, next saw him standing within the front door, which he had just opened to his visitor. "Come inside, Sir Neville," said the priest. "What can I do for you?" Neville followed him into the sitting-room. To his mind, the sitting-room was abhorrent. There were religious pictures round the wall of what appeared to him exactly the wrong type. A frightful little chipped statue of the Curé d'Ars stood on the top of the writing desk. A sham sheepskin mat lay before the hearth. A very small shelf of theological books hung near the window. A bicycle stood along one wall. Father Richardson had more than once hinted at the desirability of a proper bicycle shed for the presbytery. A white plaster crucifix hung above the fireplace, and a rack of pipes convenient to hand of one who sat in the deep basket chair. A rather bright Brussels carpet, chosen last year by the priest and paid for by Neville, covered the floor, except where rather sticky-looking varnished boards appeared below the wainscoting. A cheerful paper with hard-looking bunches of flowers that sprang, so to speak, to meet the eye covered the walls. This also last year had been chosen by the priest and paid for by Neville. The entire aspect of the room ratified and emphasized once more the opinion so rapidly forming in Neville's mind that the inhabitant of it was stuffy, second-rate, and impossible. He sat down in the basket chair, becoming aware that the seat of it was unduly depressed in one place, and prepared himself to begin. "Found the pocketbook, Father?" The priest said that he had. It was in the breast pocket of his coat all the while. Now Neville had determined to be rather stiff. Expansiveness had not succeeded, so he plunged straight into his subject. "Now that Miss Bessington has come with her mother to stay a few days, I thought I had better come round at once and tell you how matters stand." "I think she is the lady you are engaged to, is she not?" said the priest smoothly. Neville glanced up sharply. "How did you know that?" he said. Father Richardson smiled a little. He would not have been human if he had not been conscious that he was getting his own back for the defeat he had suffered the other day. "I heard it 2 or 3 days ago," he said. "It seems to be known in the village. 2 or 3 people have asked me whether it were true. I said that I was not in your confidence, Sir Neville." Neville was conscious of a very sharp and unpleasant pang of compunction. He hastily ran over in his mind the number of people he had told: Masterson, Jim, Aunt Anna, and Aunt Anna had told Mr. Morpeth. Then there were the people in Rome. It might have leaked out in half a dozen ways, and yet he had not told his own chaplain and parish priest. Yet he was conscious of another prick of anger, too. Why could not the man have taken it more courteously? What need was there to be so pointed? However, he saw he must eat humble pie. "I am very sorry, Father, you did not hear it from me direct. I had no idea that anyone knew. Beyond my very closest friends, I must apologize." The priest bowed very slightly with a faint smile. "Well, it's a fact," went on Neville. "I was coming to you in any case in a day or two with regard to the dispensation. No dates are settled yet, but I suppose that the preliminaries may as well be set on foot." "If you will give me the particulars," said the priest, "I shall be happy to make the application." Neville repressed his rising annoyance. He was convinced that the other was delighted with his own magnanimity. "Thank you, Father. Miss Bessington very much wishes to see the church tomorrow morning. Perhaps you might have the papers ready then?" "I will do so," said Father Richardson. "About 11 o'clock then?" "That will do perfectly." Neville stood up. He perceived that he must make yet further amends. "Miss Bessington and her mother will be staying a few days. I hope you will come and dine with us one evening." "Thank you, Sir Neville." "I'll let you know then." His eyes fell on the bicycle. "I've thought over that bicycle shed scheme, Father. I think perhaps it would be best to build one. It would always be useful." "Just as you please, Sir Neville." Again Neville had to check his resentment. He understood perfectly that this extraordinary detachment of manner on the part of the priest was intended as a cold and courteous rebuke. Why on earth could not the man be more genial about it? "Well, if you sketch out what you think best, I'll send it to the agent." "Thank you, Sir Neville." "Hopeless," said the young man 10 minutes later as he met Enid in the hall. "I've told him, but he's furious. It seems he heard gossip in the village about it. Lord knows how it got out." "Was he rude?" "No, too beastly polite by half. Now come round the house. We've loads of time before dressing." Subsection 5. Aunt Anna felt towards noon next day that with all the goodwill in the world she could not bear Mrs. Bessington any more at all just for the present. Mrs. Bessington found her, it appeared, a thoroughly sympathetic listener, and made the most of it. It would be an impossible task to set out in order all the subjects discussed at breakfast, but the effect upon Anna, who had to bear it all, was that it seemed as if she were trying to pour out tea and to see that people helped themselves, and that Jim did not spill the marmalade, as if she were doing these things in a kind of hailstorm. The conversation seemed to stream and beat upon her brain in an unending clatter, not loud, but universal, so to say. Beneath it, in glimpses of intelligence, she perceived other people doing things. Jim, very polite and awed, watching first one guest, then the other, and then, when observed, devoting himself to his plate again with a demure innocence. Jim had made his bow, so to say, officially last night when the gong sounded. That was a signal for the company to dress and for Jim to go to bed. He had submitted to be kissed with his usual courtesy, looking a little disconcertingly after each caress at the caresser, as if to see how she liked it. Then he had gone gravely upstairs, without turning his head. Mrs. Bessington had improved upon the situation by relating at great length the history of a niece of hers who had suffered from water on the brain some time in the last century. But Jim had his opportunity since then to observe the visitors. He had sat next to Enid at breakfast, and she had paid him the most delicate compliment that can be paid to a child. She treated him as a grown-up person, conversing with him without a single meaning glance at anyone else. Mrs. Bessington had, of course, spoken to him as if he were deaf, and never waited for an answer to her remarks. Jim had disappeared after breakfast, and there had been no opportunity of finding out what he thought of the visitors. About noon, then, when Anna, after suitable excuses, had gone off to the pavilion with her letters and had made unsuccessful attempts to answer them, and as she turned, with the end of her pen in her mouth, had seen Jim, quite alone, with his hands in his pockets, strolling across the lawn, she called to him to come in. Jim, still strolling, came up the steps. "Yes, Mummy? Come in and talk to me. I can't write any more." Jim sat down politely. "What shall I talk about?" He seemed a little depressed, thought his mother. Well, and so was she. "Where have they all gone?" The old lady," he said, "was very sleepy in the hall. Cousin Neville's taken the other one to see the church." "Why didn't you go with them?" "I think they didn't want me. And you see, I know the church quite well. Father Richardson's there, too." Jim's polite self-possession was complete. Anna felt quite sure he was depressed. He crossed one brown leg over the other and contemplated his sandal. Then he began to whistle, very gently. "Do you like them?" she asked suddenly. "Oh, yes," said Jim with a superb indifference. And at that his mother thought it better to probe no further. Subsection 6. Neville was not quite as radiant as usual, thought his aunt, as they met for lunch. It was not that he did not talk. He talked readily and easily, and suggested a run in the motor down to the sea. But there seemed to be over him a veil, as thin as a very thin cloud over the sun on a hot summer's day. By the end of lunch it had practically vanished, but Aunt Anna remembered that it had been there. It was not until after tea in the pavilion, when the two guests with Neville on the back seat and Jim beside the chauffeur had come back from the shore, that she even began to suspect the reason. Mrs. Bessington had gone back to the house to fetch a book on Phoenician coins. She was full of surprises like that. When Enid gave the clue, "Mrs. Fanning," she said, "we want to appeal to you. Neville and I had an argument." Her face shone with pleasantness. The drive had kindled a faint, even flush in her face and brightened her eyes. Her beauty certainly grew on one, thought Anna. "Tell me," said Anna. "You know I shall probably agree with my nephew." "Well, if you don't like a person, isn't it best to make friends with them instead of trying to look over the top of their head?" "Don't interrupt, Neville, please. You shall have your side presently." Neville subsided. "That depends," said Aunt Anna judiciously. "Oh, don't say that. That sounds prudent. I mean, generally speaking, supposing you had to live with somebody, for instance, whom you couldn't bear, wouldn't it be far better to try to understand them and get at their good points and so on, rather than to be very cold and polite?" "That sounds reasonable," said Anna. Enid turned a slow smile to Neville. "What did I say?" she said. "Now, put your side if you think I'm not fair." "Look here," said Neville. "It's no good beating about the bush. Put it like this. Suppose you hadn't actually got to live with a person, but had a very close neighbor. Say we were talking about Father Richardson," he said brilliantly, or anyone who could make things very unpleasant if he was tiresome. And suppose you had tried being very pleasant and all that, and things didn't go well. Then I maintain you'd better try the other thing. I'm speaking quite generally, of course." Oh, the guileless stupidity of this man, thought Aunt Anna. Neville's very device of mentioning the priest's name put the final touch on her certitude that he was exactly the person in point. Obviously, the visit to the church this morning had been the origin of this puzzle. And yet, what was she to say? She hated to take Enid's side against Neville, and yet Enid's advice had been exactly hers. She hesitated an instant. "It's no good, my dear boy," she said. "You know exactly what I think. I think Miss Bessington's theory is perfectly right." "Well," began Neville. "Why, what's up?" He was sitting in the window seat facing the door, and Anna saw his eyes change to a sudden gravity as he looked past her. She turned quickly, and there, across the lawn, came Masterson at an ambling run, with a kind of desperate consternation in his gait and face. Neville was up and at the door before Anna could move. "What is it?" she heard him say. "Miss Morpeth's an accident. Want to know if they can bring her here, out riding." He spoke brusquely and roughly, without a word of respect. She could only catch a few words, but she caught enough. Then she too was by Neville. "Of course, Masterson, anything. Tell them I'll come. Is Mr. Morpeth there?" Subsection 7. It was a very strange and subdued dinner at which the four sat that night. The tragedy had come and gone with an overwhelming swiftness, visiting the house and leaving it again, all within a couple of hours. First there had come the tragic burden, borne between four men, the hurdle torn from the hedge into which the girl's horse had bolted after an alarm from a motor just outside the village, the hurdle on which lay a still figure with open eyes. Anna had taken command with all the adequateness of which a sensitive woman alone has the secret. Enid had come forward, white-faced and excited, as the stretcher was carried in, and lifted one of the hands that hung dangling, and Aunt Anna, scarcely knowing how sharply she spoke, yet with a true commander's instinct, had bidden her leave it alone. Then she had had the hurdle carried into the morning-room, and the girl's body shifted with infinite care onto the wide chintz-covered sofa. It looked terribly like death, yet she was not absolutely sure. She had tried to force brandy into the pale lips, and had failed. Then 5 minutes later, the little gray-bearded doctor had come. "It's all over," he said after 2 minutes' examination. "The neck was broken. Death must have been instantaneous." And then Mr. Morpeth had come, fetched across the park by the house motor. It was perhaps the sharpest agony that Anna had ever experienced. This watching of the curious old man whom she was learning to like and respect so greatly. It was she who had met him in the hall and told him with a word. Neville had gone straight off for him himself, a minute before the doctor's arrival. Then she had followed him into the room where his daughter lay dead, still in her habit and boots. Anna had not dared to remove anything. She watched him go straight across to the sofa without a tremor and kneel down there without a word. From the room overhead came the soft sound of footsteps walking to and fro. A starling was twittering sharply, like a child's little musical instrument. Then, after a space of absolute silence, he had risen, kissed his daughter's forehead slowly and lingeringly, and faced round. His complexion was ashy white, but his lips were steady and his voice perfectly controlled. "If you will allow me," he had said, "I will take my daughter's body home at once." She had nodded, but she could not speak. Half an hour later the house was empty of death, but it was still strangely still. Anna could scarcely talk at all at dinner, and, with all the good will in the world, there were long silences. Enid was in black. Anna somehow did not like that, and yet thought herself unreasonable for it. Even Mrs. Besington fell a-musing again and again. There rested on them all the shadow of a tragedy and a grief that were not their own. Neville had scarcely ever seen the dead girl before, except once or twice at dinner, and Anna herself hardly more often. It was wholly of the father that she was thinking. He was alone now in that house of theirs across the park, and his daughter lay dead upstairs. There was no coherence then in the party. They drank coffee together in the hall, scarcely speaking, and presently Enid strolled without a word out onto the balustraded terrace that opened onto the gardens. After a minute or two, Neville joined her. Aunt Anna heard their voices talking together in a low tone. Then the voices grew fainter, and she heard the crunch of gravel. Outside the night had fallen still, and the sky was full of stars, against which rose up on one side, as the two paced along the walk, the great blotting masses of the cedars, and on the other the facade of the house, with lighted windows here and there. Neither of them spoke till they had turned the corner behind the presbytery, had passed down towards the river, and were standing there looking out over the low wall and listening to the rush and sway of the starlit water beyond. A great fish rose suddenly, and Enid shivered a little. "It's terrible," she said, but how splendid the night is. Did you know her well?" "No, my darling. I hardly ever saw her. I think she dined with us twice." "And the father? You know him?" "Hardly at all either. My aunt likes him very much, I believe." She leaned suddenly against him and put her hand on his shoulder. As he turned a little, he could see her face and throat glimmering palely between her dark hair and her black dress. "Neville," she said, "I think your aunt is wonderful. How splendidly she took charge of everything this afternoon." "She's like that," said Neville. "Won't she hate going from here? It must be very hard. She's been so nice to me, too. I want to ask you something." "Yes?" "Do you think I might call her Aunt Anna, too?"